My next speaker is Jon Dennis, and Jon is from Portland, and he's a lawyer he's an activist and a lawyer, and he's the co-host of Eyes on Oregon, a Psychedelics Today podcast, and he's also the champion of religious and spiritual freedoms under Oregon's fledgling psilocybin program. His talk is called Religions, Values, and Entheogenic Experiences. And I had a wonderful conversation with Jon. We just are kindred spirits. I am so happy to have him here today. Welcome, Jon.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Lakshmi. Really honored to be invited to come and talk more personal level today about some things in ways that psychedelics and plant medicines have really changed my life in a profound and positive way. I just want to reflect a little bit first, though, on kind of the tenor of today. And as I've been doing more work in this space of, psychedelics and religion, I've been really kind of touched by how there's a wide spirit of ecumenism and respect that happens between people who have a lot of really different views on these things that they all hold very dearly and very, strongly. People, when we talk about psychedelics, it often becomes a religious conversation very quickly, because I think many of us have had just very personal and profound and life-changing experiences. And so strong views and strong values kind of attached that we very quickly, become the way that we see these things. And in part because of the very individual nature of a psychedelic or entheogenic experience, that can sometimes mean very, very different things, and sometimes perhaps even inconsistent things. And it's been really interesting as I've started kind of working across multiple entheogenic communities, just what a wide variety of values and viewpoints and perspectives there are. And it's kind of really wonderful, I think, how there is this commonality of people just really finding different ways to use psychedelics as part of their highest values, part of their deepest, most spiritual selves, are able to find expression through psychedelics in just such very kind of amazing and different ways. And so it's just really been really exciting as I've been kind of doing more work. We just started an organization called the Entheogenic Practitioners Council of Oregon. And there's just a wide variety of different approaches, and it's kind of an interesting time to be in this space of not just psychedelics in general, but particularly in the psychedelics and religion kind of area of things. It's been largely a very personal and small level thing, but as communities now are starting to kind of rally together to create a voice for the cause of people who use plant medicines for spiritual and religious benefit. It's kind of a really amazing moment, I guess, in history as we are reapproaching psychedelics. Largely this was kind of occasioned, I think, by the medical research that's been underway, kind of maybe in some ways carved out a pathway, but now there's this also kind of concurrent or parallel religious resurgence that is just really kind of one of the more interesting things I think of going on probably in the world right now. But of course, I would say that because I'm really interested in it. But so I just want to acknowledge the breadth of experience and the breadth of people's relationships with plant medicines, and say that in a spirit of honor, I think that there's place for all of us, and And I think that that includes people who use it in a more medical context. And I've been kind of impressed also at the kind of resistance that comes at it, from some medical people towards the religious aspect, and from some religious people towards the medical aspect. And there's kind of just this interesting, territorialism or tribalism that I think, as people who are interested in psychedelics, and the unitive experiences and the visionary experiences, it's just kind of a really interesting dynamic, for sure. There's a question of where psychedelics fit into society, where, as they are re-entering, like, clearly, and I think everyone knows at this point in our trajectory, psychedelics are about to enter in a big way. And it's, we think about what that looks like, and we can all engage in these exercises as corporations are all teaming up to, launch their, next multi-billion-dollar company. I've been fond of citing this evidence this data I've just come across, which is that it's about $5 billion in companies that are publicly traded right now that do nothing but psychedelics, or primarily psychedelics. And none of them are even legal yet. And it's already a $5 billion industry. And that's just what companies that are publicly traded. And so, the question that I have is, as, industry does what industry is going to do, which is, kind of gobble up territory. And, you see it every time. As soon as it becomes an industry, they get lobbyists and they go to bat. And it's kind of interesting to see that starting to happen with psychedelics. And so, as a community that approaches this from a more spiritual or more religious kind of angle, it's just a really, I think it's a delicate time. And I think, I've been almost trying to make like a call to action, because in Oregon, what's going on here is just kind of crazy that, we've got people resigning from the board under abrupt conflicts of interest, claims of scandal. People are resigning from the psilocybin advisory board for relationships they're having with other companies, and other companies that are maybe not being disclosed when they were mandatorily disclosed, potentially, is the one of the things that's going on. So there's already like corruption coming to psychedelics as it is becoming kind of like mainstream, and maybe not even corruption, but just we are already starting to see capitalism do its thing. And so I think in order to protect sacred practice, and practice that is done in the context of community, outside of, kind of a business model, now is kind of the time that I think we need to speak out and help educate people, particularly in Oregon. And Oregon won't be the last place where this needs to happen, but about why psychedelics belong in community, and why business really is, it belongs too. I mean, I think that I think it all belongs. And I think that there's a place for, medical treatment and therapeutic treatment, 100%. I don't think anybody disputes that. But we're seeing right now this kind of, economic element start to do what it does with psychedelics. And it's kind of a really fragile thing. And so this is, this is the time, I think, where, if as we, I think everybody knows psychedelics are coming. But the question is, how are they going to be ushered into the mainstream? And if it's through business without a community, a counterpart, and business is just business, I just really am worried, kind of, I think a lot about what kind of psychedelic future we want to leave for our grandchildren, and what we want people's, the diversity of relationships that people can have with psychedelics. And, I think the question isn't whether we get to like mainstream access, because I think that's almost certain. I mean, I think it's certainly on its way. The question and the thing that really keeps me up at night is to think about, you know, what, like, if it happens through profit motive, you know, people may not be able to grow. I mean, we already see it in Washington, for instance. They don't have a home grow marijuana or cannabis program. It's only, you have to buy all cannabis at a dispensary. And somebody got arrested kind of recently for having like a marijuana grow in the state of Washington, despite there's people who are making like millions of dollars off of it. And so, you know, when Measure 109 came out, you know, I was always, you know, so for those of you who don't know, Oregon Measure 109 is the psilocybin law there that will legalize on-site consumption of psilocybin mushrooms, and they'll start accepting applications for this program next year. So this isn't necessarily a therapeutic model. It's a on-site consumption model with under supervision and with support. So that's kind of what's happening very, very soon. And so there's a fight over how medical to make that program versus how social versus how spiritual. And I think what happens in Oregon is going to have undeniable ripple effects for decades and decades to come. And, you know, across the whole country, this is not just Oregon. This is the model for psychedelic services that it will be the only model. So, you know, as Oregonians in this process, we think this is an Oregon matter to handle, but there's also, I think, this recognition that this is a global question that we are beginning to kind of assess for the first time, really in like modern Western history, you know. So I think it's hard to overstate kind of the importance of what's happening in Oregon right now. And you know, so for me, the question becomes, what is the role of religious activity and religious practice in a lawful program? And this is something I've devoted significant time to over the last few months and really year of trying to kind of envision a psychedelic future where it belongs to the people, it's democratized, it's social, it's respected, it's non-stigmatized, it's something that empowers communities rather than works as something that extracts from communities. And I envision it very much as a horizontal model, a community peer-to-peer type of model for psychedelic communities, rather than, well, as an option, right? So again, this comes back to there's space for everybody, but the question is, you know, if, you know, Dr. Rapp was talking earlier today about how there's this, even in the therapeutic research, there, you know, the intensity of the mystical experience is directly correlated to the positivity and effectiveness of therapeutic outcomes. So it's, you know, even in the medical context, it's still kind of a weird, you know, a spiritual medicine that, you know, how, like, where does it belong? Like, how does it fit into society? And like, we don't really know for sure. Like, you know, it can belong in the context of traditional psychotherapy. It can belong in medicine. And when I say we don't know, I think we do know, but I think we have to, but there is kind of this mainstream aspect of it that makes it something that's just kind of a novel question that we're wrestling with in some ways for the first time. But you know, if it's a primarily if it's a medicine or a tool that works through spiritual means. The question is, what is the best container to handle that medicine or that tool? And there are lots of uses for a hammer or a screwdriver, and it can solve any number of different types of things used for different things. So but clearly 100% undisputed, I think, what is that this is basically a that it belongs in religious and spiritual context as a tool for religious and spiritual self-development and improvement. So that is the mechanism. So as Oregon's wrestling with this, the question is, how affordable do we make it? How accessible do we make it? And what's the container? And so that's been the work that I have devoted significant time to here over the last few months and about the last year. So I got off on the tangent there. I was going to initially start by talking about a entheogenic experience, and thank you, Lakshmi, again for inviting me to talk here on a more personal note. So I think there are several risks that we run when we talk about our own personal entheogenic experiences. One of those is just an enhanced criminal risk that is a real reality for many communities, and some more so than others. But there is kind of that risk of of getting fired, or of being shamed, of people taking you less seriously because they think that you've taken a drug and that somehow makes you less credible. On the other hand, you also run a kind of an opposite risk of some people maybe taking it too seriously and kind of grasping onto somebody's experiences. So I really appreciated, Marty, your presentation earlier today and your talk about Abraham Maslow. And I think one of the aspects of entheogenic and other peak experiences that I think is really kind of problematic in some ways is that if a person's never had a religious experience, the only way you can really describe it is through metaphor and through analogy, and it's a fundamentally ineffable experience, and words can't really do it any justice whatsoever. So you're left with these clumsy things of words to try to articulate it, and of course that doesn't ever do it justice. So somebody who's never had an entheogenic experience or a religious experience or mystical experience, here's a person talking about a mystical experience, and they don't really have any personal firsthand reference for what that must be like. But to the extent that what they describe is something that has resonance with them, or the person describing it feels authentic to them, or when you hear somebody talking about a spiritual experience and you feel inspired by them talking about it, if you've never had that experience, the best you can do is kind of latch onto the words. And Abraham Maslow, in his seminal book called Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences, he kind of hypothesizes that the formation of religious institutions was basically somebody who's never had a mystical experience getting stuck on the metaphor and turning it into an idol or into a symbol that they don't really understand, but they kind of, or they misunderstand it. And that's kind of his theory that I thought a lot about when I was in my early 20s. And I think that that's kind of the way that we start to signal meaning, and becomes its own sort of meaning apart from the original impetus for the meaning. So when we talk about so Maslow writes this book that kind of posits that all founders of all religious traditions were peakers, or people who had mystical experiences, and he said that two peakers of two different traditions, two mystics of like a Christian mystic and a Buddhist mystic or something, would have more in common with each other than a Christian mystic and a non-Christian mystic. That the kind of mystical siblinghood between sensitive people who have peak experiences makes them in some ways have a better, more fundamental understanding of one another than it does somebody who is within their own tradition. So anyway, so there's that. Maslow's kind of theory here. And I wonder, particularly now, as you know, the fastest growing type of religious self-identification in the country right now is people who identify as spiritual but not religious. We as a society have a lot of religious trauma. Many people were ostracized from religions. Religion judged them. It told them they were going to hell. It told them they were bad people. You know, in our American society, religion has become something that, like, people are really they even hate the word. They think I'm not religious. Like they're more, you know, as I've described the work that I do and talk about it as, you know, religious freedom protection, the people who resonate most strongly with it frequently are people who have been traumatized deeply by religion and who are like spiritually on a quest or on a search, but they have a particular aversion to the word religion. And it's kind of an interesting time for psychedelics to be kind of making their way into the mainstream as we have these kind of religiously or spiritually sort of disenfranchised people who are in deep need of spiritual healing. So I think Oregon's work here is, you know, just the beginning of that. And I think, you know, we as people who emphasize, you know, we're talking about entheogens here and not necessarily, you know, psychedelics, you know, the people whose relationship with these substances, with these plants, these fungi, and, you know, and perhaps even people who might use, you know, LSD or other you know, synthetics in a sort of, you know, spiritual way. You know, the thing that binds us is just that we believe that they can be done, and that is, you know, it's something that needs to be protected as this renaissance unfolds, sort of thing. So this the thing I wanted to talk about with my experience was essentially it was you know, during a spiritual high point in my life, and also kind of a time where I was depressed at the, you know, concurrently. And, you know, I had been, you know, working, kind of coming down from a place where I felt tied in and I felt community and I felt, you know, connected to, like, my work was meaningful. And, you know, and I find myself in this small town after kind of a lot of disappointment and feeling like maybe a failure, like maybe things, you know, kind of just a depressive time for a lot of reasons. While also having a very dedicated meditation practice. At that point in my life, I'd been, you know, spending 30 to 40 minutes outside every morning for probably, you know, nine months or so. And so I was really dialed in at just, you know, my attentional powers were maybe the highest they'd been at any point in my life. And so I, you know, just had kind of a high dose of mushrooms and basically, you know, so this is where I say, you know, these are metaphors. These aren't, you know, and the thing is, like, you know, Carl Hart says we need to be talking more and more about about using drugs, and more people need to come out of sort of the closet, so to speak, because there is really important work that we have to help normalize this. So thank you, Lakshmi, for holding this event, because it's just this, it's time, but anyway. The experience was essentially sort of like a magnifying glass, with my attention was being kind of harnessed like a sun with a magnifying glass, and it kind of ended up searing this hole into this wall, and this bright light came out from behind the light, and it was what I perceived in that moment to be God, and seeing God, face to face, being, humbled. There's obviously like no words for that sort of thing, and essentially, then there being kind of a retelling of my life, where it was like a game of connect the dots. Things I had never even thought about in many years, or it's like you're here, and then later you're here, and drawing connections and associations between life events that I'd never even put together, and just like this nice little arc, and then it was like, and here you are, and and you may not know why you're here, suffering through this. You may not know like the reason, but this is not the end of the line. Like there's a point after this, and you may not know it right now, but there's a reason why you're here, and this is going somewhere too. So just relax and try to learn what this moment has to teach, because there is something ahead still, and that is a lesson I have returned to, repeatedly throughout the course of my life. It's a experience I still continue to integrate to this day, and I think that there's just a certain kind of delicate nature about spiritual experience that I think most of us who are going to watch this video, I think, or who who come to psychedelics, and who are not just a casual person, but a person who's going to watch the internet videos about people talking about their experiences and trying to make a meaning out of their experiences. I think I think we all just share this kind of reverence for the ability that entheogens have to catalyze powerful, positive life changes, and that involve healing and involve wisdom. So yeah, thank you again, Lakshmi, for inviting me to talk here, and yeah, I guess we can go to questions if anybody has any. Yeah, hi, Nicole.
Hi, Jon. Thanks for sharing your personal story and the challenges that come with that in the current landscape, and your involvement with all of the things in Oregon, and being someone who is involved in such policy conversations in Colorado and in Denver. I kind of posed a similar question to Jerry earlier of like, what might we not already be doing? And so I'm curious, from your current position of what you know and what you've seen this far, what might you offer other localities and states going forward, and not just kind of stamping this model that Oregon has brought forward? What might be a couple of points that you would offer poignantly in terms of what you might do differently, what you would like to see other localities, how that might be approached in a different way that considers some of the holistic pieces that you're now aware of?
Wow, thank you for that question, Nicole. If I understand the question correctly, like how can other localities avoid the problems that Oregon's having now? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it. Like essentially, like if you were to go back and start from the beginning, like what would those first steps even look like?
Well, okay, yeah. So I think there's a lot of stakeholders here. There's a lot, and this isn't necessarily intended as a criticism of Measure 109. I think at the time it was drafted, it was, I really am a big believer in the structure and the, what it does in terms of providing some basic safeguards for people to use psychedelics in different helpful ways with support and safety screenings and with complaint systems in place, and I think there's a lot of things about it that are just really good. I think where Oregon may have gone wrong with that model is that the board that is making the rules are mostly medical doctors and therapists and people who don't necessarily have, like, I think entheogenic practitioners are not really represented hardly at all. There's some people who have meaningful involvement with Fireside, but Project and Zindo and things like that, but none of them are from like the kind of entheogenic community per se. The other, I guess, major thing that probably is problematic about 109 is about there should be decrim. I mean, I started off really judging decrim folks for opposing Measure 109. But as I've watched this process unfold, I've become apologetic to them for dismissing that concern and thinking that was letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I judged them and said that, that's probably too extreme. There's people suffering who need help now. So, but as I've seen kind of the business interests take it over, I don't think it's guaranteed we'll ever cycle back to decrim if we don't ensure that there's a non-moneyed option within the program. So I think that's a really hard and delicate conversation, but I think it's one that we can't be naive about if we're doing this work.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah. Hi, Marty.
Jon, this is a question / comment. I picked up earlier when you mentioned, the threat of prosecution, or I'm not sure exactly what to call it, of being open and honest about psychedelic use and how people react to that. In the academic community, very much so. If you're a researcher working with psychedelics, there is a really big question mark, and people are very judgmental as to whether you should be taking psychedelics while you're also researching and writing about psychedelics. And I wondered if you had any stories or experiences from your perspective on if something has happened that you're aware of somebody being targeted or prosecuted in this way.
Yeah. It's such an important issue. I don't have any good anecdotes about that specifically. Somebody else here might. What I have been curious about, because I'm a believer that if you are going to be administering materials and these medicines, you really need to hold on for just 1 second. Sorry.
I have one of those as well, and mine does the same.
Yeah, I think the problem is, well, yeah. So one of the issues that's come up in Oregon is, should facilitators be required to take psilocybin as a precondition for becoming a facilitator? And I believe strongly that they really have to, or really need to, unless they have a medical reason why they can't. It's like it would be crazy to think of a person being a guide and have never done the thing that they're guiding in. And so, there is like all this weird stigma that gets attached to it, and like it's going to somehow make you biased, like negative, like it's going to make you like somehow invalidate your objectivity as a clinician or a researcher, if you've ever had these states. But I almost think it would bias you more if you've never had them and had a less like knowledgeable understanding of them. But yeah.
So a few more
yeah.
minutes. I just want to interject that we're breaking for lunch now for half an hour. But if someone wants to stay on and talk, you can do that. But I just wanted to let everyone know that we're breaking for lunch. We'll meet again at 1 p.m. or 5 after 1. But please continue on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I don't know if anybody else.
I have a question about, so this is really what Dr. Jerry Brown was saying about the books, that the Psychedelic Gospels book that he wrote, and the other research, and how it was going to set a precedent. It shows that there is a precedent for the use of psilocybin in pre-Christian, early Christian times. So that sounds like a very hopeful thing for us, because most of the Western world comes from those Christian roots. So could there be a future where psychedelic Christian churches are serving a real sacrament?
Well, I would just offer, I don't consider non-psychoactive sacraments to not be like real or authentic sacraments. I think in the spirit of ecumenism and respect, we respect people who in the traditions that don't approach their higher power in the same way that we do. But to answer your question, I think there are, so the law on this is fairly complex at present. So essentially, it's a state by state issue how protected you are, because you have strong federal protections. But so Kentucky, ironically, has more religious freedom than Oregon does with regard to psychedelics. So I will contextualize it and start by saying that's my preface for what I'm about to say, which is that religious movements pop up all the time. They are, we talk about living traditions versus not like dead traditions that aren't, if there's people who are alive and practicing something in the religious kind of realm, it's by nature changing just every day because society is changing and the practices continue to evolve. And so when a religion starts and when it stops is kind of a more fluid thing than I think people tend to think about it being. And I think there's already plenty of people who could make a really interesting argument. I mean, what's important isn't the actual validity of the thing that you believe in, it's about the sincerity with which you believe it. I mean, we don't go back and say, did Jesus really die on a cross or something like that and make Christians prove it in order to become a Christian, right? We don't make them prove anything because it's a belief system, and we validate not the beliefs themselves necessarily, but the fact that they believe them is enough. So whether or not there was actually mushrooms being consumed by early Christians, I think in some ways kind of irrelevant to the question of if some Christians sincerely believe that and believe that they have to continue to carry on that tradition, like today, and that's a sincere thing that they do. I don't think whether or not they're accurate about the historicity of that practice, those aren't things that courts really look at, whether or not they were actually doing it. I think there's probably already enough out there in the literature between, I haven't even read Immortality Key yet. I know, shame on me. Sorry, Brian. No, but I think there's enough kind of popular literature out there kind of describing religious traditions having origins in psychedelics that I don't think it has to be actually true. I think you just have to believe that it's true in order to make a clear argument for federal law purposes that that's what you believe, and that's how you approach your higher power is through that kind of practice. I think you can just so the short answer is yes. At a federal level, that may not necessarily protect you in your particular state. And this is an extremely complicated topic. This is not intended as advice. If you want to have advice about these things, this is a long conversation. So this is super general. But yeah, excellent question.
Thank you, John. So I would really love to know more about that question and the ins and outs, because I understood that the peyote, they had to prove their use of it ancestrally for peyote to become legal for the Native American church. So I thought the same precedent was involved here. I personally think that the interpretation of that law, the religious freedom law, is that you shouldn't need to have a precedent. Anyone can worship in any way that they so please. It's a personal relationship with God or higher power, whatever you call it. So I'm curious, but I don't think you're right. We don't have time for that conversation right now, but maybe we can have something else where we discuss it in more detail.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in having that conversation. When I was doing my class through Psychedelics Today on the topic of religious liberties in the US, one of the things that really jumped out at me as I was kind of preparing for and the interviews and interviewing these kind of experts in those worlds, in that realm of things, was just that kind of private individual use. Nobody thinks that gets protected. It really has to be corporate or community, like a corporal, meaning coming together, or community type of use. So like a person's private spiritual explorations really, at present, the current case law doesn't seem to suggest that they would get really any level of protection, which is really unfortunate, I think, particularly where a lot of us are these sort of religious or spiritual orphans who feel like traumatized by the religions that they grew up in. We're kind of a seeker's culture in a way that is we're largely distrusting of institutions and particularly large, powerful ones. So religion for many people is more of a turnoff than it feels like a safe space. And what does that mean for religious liberties in an area where more and more people are saying that they're spiritual but not religious? It's kind of anyway. I got on my soapboxes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think I'm going to close this right now so we can take a break for lunch.